Welcome back to Inside True Stories. Today we uncover a heartbreaking and inspiring tale of sacrifice, betrayal, and justice. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter, a decorated Army veteran who fought bravely overseas, only to discover that while he risked his life for his country, his own community betrayed him. The Homeowners Association he trusted sold his beloved ranch behind his back. But what they forgot is that this soldier had been trained to never surrender. And when he returned home, he was ready for the fight of his life. Daniel Carter was not an ordinary man. He was the kind of soldier who carried both strength and humility in equal measure. Born in a small southern town, Daniel grew up watching his father work the land with calloused hands and unshakable pride. The ranch they lived on was more than just acres of soil and fences. It was the Carter family's legacy, passed down from his grandfather, who built it after returning from World War II. Every fence post and barn beam carried a story of resilience, sacrifice, and hope. As a boy, Daniel learned discipline not from a drill sergeant, but from early mornings feeding horses and mending fences. His father would often say, "A man who cares for the land learns to care for life." These words etched themselves into Daniel's heart and became his compass, guiding him long before he ever wore an Army uniform. When Daniel enlisted, it was not out of desperation, but out of devotion. Devotion to a country he loved and a promise he made to his late father, that he would protect not only the soil beneath his boots, but the principles of freedom and honor that soil stood for. His service took him to faraway deserts and hostile battlefields, where danger was constant and sacrifice inevitable. Yet even in the darkest of places, his thoughts often wandered home, to the ranch, the smell of fresh hay, the sound of horses galloping across open fields, and the porch where his mother used to hum lullabies on summer nights. After years of deployments and countless sacrifices, Daniel finally purchased the ranch outright. He poured his military savings into repairing the farmhouse, planting crops, and building stables. For him, the ranch symbolized peace, a sanctuary where he could someday retire, raise a family, and heal from the scars of war. Neighbors admired him for his work ethic, and many looked up to him as a quiet hero who never bragged about his medals or accomplishments. But as fate would have it, Daniel's country called again. His unit was deployed overseas on a high-risk mission. Though leaving the ranch was painful, Daniel trusted his community and the local Homeowners Association to maintain order in his absence. To him, the HOA was nothing more than a bureaucratic formality, a group of neighbors tasked with keeping streets tidy and fences aligned. He never imagined they could wield the power to threaten his livelihood. With a final walk through his land, Daniel touched the gatepost his father had carved decades ago, whispering, "I'll be back soon. Old friend." The ranch stood silent, steadfast, and loyal. Daniel left believing it would be waiting for him when he returned from war. He could not have been more wrong. At first, the neighborhood looked as ordinary as ever. Trimmed hedges, tidy sidewalks, and neatly painted mailboxes gave the illusion of peace. But beneath that suburban calm, the Homeowners Association operated like a shadow government. What should have been a simple organization dedicated to keeping lawns mowed and properties clean had, over the years, grown into something far more sinister. The HOA board was led by Richard Halpern, a man who thrived on power. Richard was not a soldier, nor had he ever worked the land like Daniel. He was a businessman who wore pressed suits even in the heat of summer, his smile more polished than sincere. To him, property was not about legacy or family. It was about leverage, money, and control. He saw every empty lot, every home with a struggling owner, as an opportunity, and Daniel's ranch, sitting on prime land at the edge of the community, was the crown jewel he had long wanted to seize. When Daniel deployed overseas, Richard saw his chance. The HOA sent letters, first small, then increasingly threatening. They claimed Daniel had unpaid fees for community maintenance and violations for unapproved structures on his land, like his horse stables and the rustic barn his father had built decades earlier. Of course, Daniel never received these notices. They piled up in his mailbox while he slept in military tents thousands of miles away. At board meetings, Richard whispered to his allies on the committee, "Carter's gone again. Who knows if he'll even come back this time? That land is wasted on him. We could sell it to the developer, put in new townhomes, increase everyone's property value. The others hesitated at first. After all, Daniel was a respected veteran. But Richard knew how to twist arms. He promised lower HOA dues for everyone if the ranch was sold. He hinted at kickbacks from the developers, and one by one the board members nodded, convincing themselves it was legal, even necessary. By the time Daniel was deep in enemy territory, risking his life for his country, the HOA had already moved forward with foreclosure proceedings. They filed paperwork in court, citing unpaid dues and neglect. They deliberately chose a court date knowing Daniel could not appear to defend himself. With no one present to fight for him, the judge signed off on the order. In just a few weeks, the ranch that had stood in Daniel's family for generations was listed for auction. Neighbors whispered about the injustice, but fear silenced them. Everyone knew the HOA's reach. They could fine you, lien your home, or drag you through endless legal battles. A few tried to call Daniel's family, but his mother had passed, and his only sister lived out of state. By the time word might have reached him, the land had already been sold to a wealthy real estate investor. The betrayal was complete. While Daniel was dodging bullets and leading his men through hostile terrain overseas, the ranch he loved was stripped from him in boardrooms and court filings. Richard and his cronies toasted quietly over glasses of scotch, congratulating themselves on their victory. What they did not know was that this story was far from over, because they had forgotten who Daniel Carter truly was, a man who had never lost a fight, no matter how impossible it seemed. The desert sun still clung to Daniel's uniform as he stepped off the transport plane onto American soil. His boots, worn from months of deployment, touched the ground with a quiet relief. He had made it home. The air felt different here, calmer, softer, filled with a scent he had missed more than he could put into words. As the military bus dropped him off near his small town, Daniel carried a single duffel bag and the weight of countless memories. His body was tired, his shoulders sore from years of service, but his spirit was lifted by a single thought: home. The ranch would be there, waiting for him like an old friend. The drive back filled him with anticipation. He imagined opening the gate, hearing the creak of its hinges, and walking across the familiar dirt path to the porch. He imagined saddling his horse, feeling the steady rhythm beneath him as he rode out across the fields at sunset. These thoughts carried him forward, easing the ache of war. But when he reached the road leading to his ranch, something felt wrong. The first thing he noticed was the fence. Not the sturdy wooden posts his father had once carved, but a cheap metal barrier with a lock he did not recognize. Confused, Daniel approached, expecting maybe a mistake, maybe construction. Then his eyes fell on the large, bold letters nailed to the post: sold. His breath caught. He dropped his duffel bag where he stood, dust rising in the wind. Beyond the fence, the land looked altered. Machinery had torn into the soil, marking out plots with bright orange stakes. The barn door, once painted by his father's hands, hung crooked and lifeless. Strangers moved across his property, their trucks parked where his horses once grazed. A young worker spotted him staring through the fence. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked casually, not recognizing the soldier. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is my land," he said, his voice steady but trembling with suppressed fury. The worker shook his head. "Not anymore. Bought up by the developer. HOA paperwork said it was vacant, foreclosed. You might be mistaken." The words hit Daniel like a bullet. Mistaken? Could he truly be standing outside the gates of his own ranch? Denied entry like a trespasser on his father's soil? He demanded answers, storming into town. At the county office, he asked for records, and what he saw chilled him. His name crossed out, the property deed signed over to an investor. The paperwork bore the HOA's stamp, citing unpaid dues and neglected structures. Daniel knew instantly these were lies. He had paid every cent. He had cared for every beam, every nail. That night, Daniel sat in a cheap motel room, staring at the stack of documents the clerk had reluctantly given him. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. Months of service, of risking his life for the very freedoms his community enjoyed, and this was his reward: betrayal. For the first time in years, Daniel felt powerless. He had fought enemy combatants, survived ambushes, and carried wounded brothers from the battlefield. But now, back on American soil, he had lost a war he never even knew he was fighting. He closed his eyes and thought of his father's words. A man who cares for the land learns to care for life. If the land was gone, what was left? The fire inside him burned stronger than the despair. He would not accept this. He would not allow his father's legacy to be erased by greedy men in suits. The HOA had taken his ranch, but they had also awakened something they could never contain. Daniel Carter had returned home, and the real battle was only beginning. The morning after his discovery, Daniel walked into a law office in town, his duffel bag still slung over his shoulder, uniform pressed from travel. The receptionist glanced at him with polite curiosity before ushering him to a conference room. Moments later, attorney Mark Phillips, a well-dressed man with sharp glasses, entered. Daniel wasted no time. He spread out the paperwork on the table. "They took my ranch," he said, his voice low and steady. "The HOA foreclosed on it while I was deployed. They said I didn't pay fees." "That's a lie." Mark skimmed the documents, frowning. "This is serious, but it's going to be an uphill battle." Daniel leaned forward, fists clenched. "I've fought uphill battles before." The attorney explained that while the law provided some protections for active duty military personnel, HOAs often exploited loopholes. They claimed failure to respond or neglected violations, and courts, overwhelmed with cases, signed off without hesitation. Worse, the HOA had powerful legal representation, a firm known for burying opponents under paperwork. Still, Daniel was determined. He hired Mark and filed a lawsuit to challenge the foreclosure. The case went to court within weeks. Inside the courtroom, Daniel sat in his uniform, medals pinned to his chest, a visible reminder of his service. Across the aisle sat Richard Halpern and the HOA's lawyers, smug and confident. Richard smirked as if victory was already his. The HOA's counsel argued with cold precision. Mr. Carter was notified of his dues and violations on multiple occasions. He failed to respond. He failed to appear in prior hearings. The HOA acted within its legal rights to foreclose and sell the property. Daniel's attorney countered, his voice sharp. "My client was deployed overseas, serving this country when these notices were sent. Federal law clearly states that service members are to be protected from civil actions in their absence. The HOA exploited his absence to seize property that has been in his family for generations." The judge, an older man with tired eyes, tapped his gavel lightly. "I sympathize with Sergeant Carter," he said, "but the court is bound by the evidence presented. The HOA has followed procedure. Unless new evidence is shown, the foreclosure stands." Daniel's chest tightened. Procedure? Was justice nothing more than fine print and paperwork? He left the courtroom furious but not broken. For weeks, he and Mark filed appeals, but each time the HOA's lawyers produced more documents, signed notices, certified letters supposedly sent to his address, all unanswered. Daniel knew they had deliberately chosen court dates while he was overseas. He had no way of proving otherwise. Meanwhile, Richard Halpern grew bolder. At a local cafe, Daniel overheard him laughing with his cronies. Soldier Boy thought he could come back and play cowboy on that land. "It's ours now. He'll tire out soon enough." Every word was a spark to Daniel's growing fire. Back at his motel, he sat surrounded by paperwork. Frustration gnawed at him. For the first time in years, he felt cornered, not by enemy fire, but by a system rigged against him. He realized this was not a battle of bullets, but of patience, strategy, and truth. He had been trained for war, and though this war looked different, he knew one thing: you never give up ground that is rightfully yours. The legal walls were high, but Daniel began to see cracks. The HOA had grown arrogant, and arrogance often left trails. It was time to stop reacting and start investigating. The motel room had become Daniel's war tent. Papers were scattered across the bed like battlefield maps, court transcripts, HOA bylaws, foreclosure notices. Most men would have been defeated after the judge's dismissal, but Daniel Carter was not most men. He had led soldiers through ambushes, survived with little more than grit, and carried his brothers out of firefights. This, he reminded himself, was just another battlefield. One evening, as he sifted through the paperwork, Daniel noticed something strange. A foreclosure notice bore his signature, authorizing acknowledgement of debt. His blood ran cold. It was not his handwriting. He had never signed such a document. He took it to his attorney the next morning. Mark frowned as he examined it. "This looks forged," he admitted. But proving it, he hesitated. Daniel's eyes hardened. "I don't need to prove it yet. I just need to follow the trail." And so he began. By day, he visited the county records office, combing through property transfers and HOA filings. By night, he spoke to neighbors, some hesitant, some eager to finally unburden themselves. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Daniel was not the first victim. Families had been harassed, fined unfairly, and in some cases forced to sell under pressure. Most had stayed quiet, fearing the cost of a legal fight. Then a break came. A retired HOA secretary, Mrs. Whitfield, agreed to meet him in secret. Her hands trembled as she slid a folder across the diner table. "I shouldn't have kept these," she whispered. "But I knew something was wrong. They falsified signatures. They pushed through votes that never happened. Mr. Halpern, he's been working with a developer for years. Your ranch was the prize." Daniel's jaw clenched. The documents inside were damning. Proof of backroom deals, evidence of forgery, emails showing collusion between Richard Halpern and the developer. Still, he knew evidence alone would not win. The HOA had lawyers, money, influence. Daniel needed more. He needed visibility. That was when a young journalist named Emily Reyes entered the story. She had heard whispers about the veteran who lost his ranch and approached Daniel for an interview. At first, he was reluctant. Soldiers were trained to fight quietly, not broadcast their battles. But as Emily explained, sunlight is the best disinfectant. If people see what's happening, they will care. The article hit the local papers first, then spread online. The headline read, "HOA seizes soldier's ranch while he serves overseas, a betrayal at home." Outrage followed. Veterans groups reached out, offering support. Neighbors who once stayed silent began showing up at Daniel's motel room with their own stories of HOA abuse. And across the country, strangers sent letters of encouragement, donations, and prayers. For the first time, Daniel felt the tide turning. He was no longer fighting alone. At an HOA meeting shortly after the article's release, Richard Halpern sat at the head of the table, smug as ever. But when Daniel entered the room, dressed not in uniform but in civilian clothes with the strength of a soldier still in his stride, the room grew quiet. He carried a thick binder under his arm. "You thought I was gone," Daniel said, his voice steady, eyes locked on Halpern. "You thought you could steal what my father built, what I bled for. You forgot who I am. I don't run from battles. I finish them." Halpern smirked, but his eyes flickered with unease. For the first time, he realized this was not going to be easy. The war for the ranch had truly begun, and Daniel was no longer on the defensive. The article had lit a fire, but it was Daniel's unwavering resolve that kept it burning. Calls began pouring in, not just from strangers online, but from men and women Daniel had once stood beside in battle. "Carter," one familiar voice said over the phone, deep and steady, "heard what they did to you. You don't fight this one alone." Within a week, several of his army brothers arrived in town, some driving across states to stand at his side. They were men who had marched through deserts with him, men who trusted him with their lives. When they showed up at the HOA's next public meeting, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying themselves with the same sharp discipline of soldiers, the boardroom felt the weight of their presence. Neighbors who had once whispered their complaints in hushed tones now stood tall, emboldened by Daniel's example. An elderly couple admitted that they had nearly lost their home years earlier to the same scheme. A single mother confessed she had been fined thousands for trivial violations. The more people spoke, the clearer the truth became. Daniel's fight was not just about one ranch. It was about every homeowner bullied into silence. The HOA tried to dismiss them as troublemakers, but Emily Reyes, the young journalist, attended each meeting with her notepad and recorder. Every heated word, every testimony, every attempt by Richard Halpern to shut down dissent was captured and published. The story was no longer just local. It was spreading across state lines. Soon, national veteran organizations took notice. Donations poured into Daniel's legal fund. Letters arrived by the dozen, some from soldiers thanking him for fighting a battle they all feared, others from ordinary families who had been crushed by HOAs, and finally saw hope in his struggle. One Saturday morning, Daniel awoke to the sound of voices outside his motel window. He pulled back the curtain and froze. Dozens of people, neighbors, veterans, church members, even strangers, had gathered with signs. Some read, "Justice for Daniel." Others declared, "Stop HOA corruption." It wasn't just a protest. It was a movement. When Daniel stepped outside, the crowd erupted in applause. A fellow veteran placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You fought for us overseas," the man said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Now let us fight with you here." For the first time since his return, Daniel felt something more powerful than anger. He felt hope. The ranch was his legacy, but this fight was becoming larger than land. It was about principle, justice, and ensuring no soldier, no family, would ever again be betrayed in such a way. Richard Halpern and his board had underestimated him. They thought they had buried a soldier under paperwork and procedure. Instead, they had awoken a warrior backed by a brotherhood and a community unwilling to back down. The balance of power was shifting. The HOA had money. Daniel now had people. And in battles both overseas and at home, Daniel knew one thing. An army of truth and unity always outlasted an empire built on lies. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread beyond the town. Reporters with cameras stood on the steps. Veterans in uniform filled the benches. And neighbors who had once cowered under the HOA's authority now came forward with courage written across their faces. Daniel walked into the courtroom wearing his uniform, not for show, but as a reminder of the oath he had taken, the same oath that had kept him overseas while his home was stolen. Behind him marched his brothers in arms, sitting tall in the gallery, their presence alone a silent declaration. He does not stand alone. At the front table, Richard Halpern adjusted his tie nervously. His smug smile had vanished. He had hired the best lawyers money could buy, but for the first time, he felt the tide had turned. The walls of arrogance he had built around himself were beginning to crack. The judge entered, and the room hushed. The proceedings began. The HOA's attorney was first, arguing coldly as before. "Your Honor, the association acted within its legal rights. Notices were issued, procedures were followed, and the property was lawfully sold. Sergeant Carter may be sympathetic, but sympathy does not override the law." When it was Daniel's lawyer's turn, Mark Phillips rose with quiet confidence. He laid out document after document, piece after piece of evidence. First, the forged signature, proven false by a handwriting expert. Then, internal emails from Richard Halpern and the developer, uncovered by Mrs. Whitfield, showing plans to target Daniel's ranch months before foreclosure proceedings began. Finally, testimonies from neighbors, each recounting their own harassment, fines, and threats, painting a picture of an HOA that was not maintaining community order, but weaponizing power for profit. The most powerful moment came when Daniel himself took the stand. He stood tall, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. "I served overseas to protect the freedoms we all share. While I was there, I trusted my community to protect my home, my family's legacy. Instead, men who were supposed to represent fairness and order stole it from me. They didn't just take land. They betrayed trust, and if they could do it to me, they can do it to anyone." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression softened. When cross-examined, Richard Halpern tried to maintain his composure, but the evidence was damning. His voice faltered, his explanations twisted, and under pressure, contradictions spilled out. The man who once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist now looked cornered and desperate. The judge's gavel struck at last. "This court finds that the foreclosure was unlawful, that documents were falsified, and that the HOA acted with deliberate malice. The sale of Sergeant Carter's property is hereby nullified. Full ownership is restored to him. Furthermore, this court orders an investigation into the conduct of the HOA and its leadership. The gallery erupted in applause. Veterans stood to their feet, saluting Daniel. Neighbors embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Even the reporters, usually detached, looked moved by the triumph of justice. Daniel sat back in his chair, relief washing over him. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was justice. For himself, for his father's memory, and for every family silenced by HOA abuse. Richard Halpern was led out of the courtroom, his empire collapsing around him. The power he once wielded so ruthlessly had crumbled under the weight of truth. For Daniel, the battle was won. But the war for justice had just begun. The gates of Daniel Carter's ranch swung open once more, this time under his own authority. The sunlight spilled across the fields, glinting off the fences, barns, and pastures that had endured decades of family care. The land smelled of earth and promise, the same scent he had dreamed of returning to during long nights overseas. Neighbors and veterans joined him that morning, carrying tools, paint, and supplies. They worked side by side, repairing the stables, repainting fences, and restoring the barns that had suffered neglect under the HOA's watch. Children ran through the fields, laughing freely as if sensing that this land, once nearly lost, was now a place of hope again. Daniel's heart swelled as he watched his army brothers guiding his horses back into the stables. They laughed and joked, but each movement carried a quiet respect, not just for the ranch, but for the man who had refused to surrender. Sitting on the porch that evening, Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe. The ranch was his again, yes, but more importantly, he had seen the power of community, resilience, and truth. What had begun as a fight for property had become a fight for justice, a fight that inspired people far beyond his small town. Emily Reyes, the journalist who had first helped bring the story to light, approached with a notebook in hand. "You turned this into more than a personal victory," she said. "You showed the world that courage and persistence matter." Daniel smiled quietly. "I didn't do it alone. None of us do." And she was right. Veterans who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in combat, neighbors who had found their voice, and even strangers who believed in right over wrong, all had played a role. Together they had faced greed, corruption, and betrayal, and together they had won. The HOA had been exposed, its corrupt leadership removed, and policies were being implemented to protect deployed service members from such injustice in the future. Daniel's fight had sparked change, ensuring no other veteran would experience what he endured. As the sun set over the rolling fields of the ranch, Daniel reflected on the journey. He had lost much, but he had gained even more. Purpose renewed, community strengthened, and the knowledge that no system, no matter how powerful, could defeat a soldier who refused to give up. From the edge of despair to the triumph of justice, Daniel Carter's story was more than a tale of a stolen ranch. It was a testament to courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between those who fight for what is right. And on Inside True Stories, it serves as a reminder. Sometimes the battles we face at home are as challenging as those on the battlefield. But with perseverance, truth, and unity, victory is always possible.